I always thought love was about enduring the rough patches. I believed that if you gave enough of yourself, stayed patient and stayed present, eventually the bond would deepen. That's what I told myself every day for the last 9 years of my marriage. I was a high school guidance counselor, not the most glamorous job, but one I loved. My wife Claire was a pediatric nurse, strong-willed, empathetic, and striking in that effortless, natural kind of way. The kind of woman who didn't need to dress up to turn heads. She was my world. I'd built my life around her because she was, to me, everything. But all it took was one night, one overheard conversation to tear all of it down. It was a Thursday. I had stayed late at school helping a student work through a crisis. His parents were getting divorced, and he didn't know who to trust anymore. Ironic, now that I think about it. I walked through our front door, the scent of bergamot and lemon balm from Claire's diffuser greeting me like usual. I loosened my tie, took off my shoes, and padded quietly toward the kitchen. And then I heard her. At first I thought she was on the phone with a co-worker. Her tone was casual, her voice soft but expressive. Eli just doesn't get it. I can't stand being around him anymore. I stopped cold. My name was a bullet between the ribs. I feel like I'm slowly fading just being with him. He's so predictable, there's no spark, no tension, just the same old routine, every damn day. I couldn't move. I didn't breathe. I stood there, framed by the hallway shadows, staring down the oak floorboards like they held the answer to why my life was unraveling. Then came the hammer blow. I haven't loved him for a long time. I don't know how to leave. I felt my knees weaken. Claire's voice didn't carry hate. That almost would have been easier. It carried exhaustion, resignation, like I was a pair of comfortable shoes she'd outgrown but didn't want to throw away. My mind screamed to confront her, to walk into the living room and demand an explanation. But my feet disobeyed. I turned away and climbed the stairs to our bedroom like a ghost. My hands moved on autopilot, opening the closet, pulling out a small gym duffel I hadn't touched in months. I packed blindly. T-shirts, boxers, socks, my shaving kit. I glanced up and saw the framed photo of our wedding day on the dresser. Claire looked radiant, her head leaned against my chest, her eyes full of promises. I reached for it, then stopped. What was the point? As I zipped the bag, I heard her laugh downstairs. Light, carefree. It was like getting stabbed again. When I walked into the living room, Claire looked up, and her world stopped. Eli? She blinked. Where are you going? I didn't answer. Not yet. I needed to see it. The panic, the realization, the flicker of guilt crossing her face like an eclipse. That was the only confirmation I needed, that she knew exactly what I had heard. I hope you find what you're looking for, Claire, I said, my voice calm but hollow. Wait, what are you? I turned and walked out. I didn't know where I was headed, only that it wasn't back here. The night was cold, but my skin felt numb. My mind was racing, playing back every small detail from the past year, the subtle ways her affection had shifted, the empty I love yous, the way she barely looked up from her phone anymore. How had I missed it? I got into my car and sat there, hands on the steering wheel, shaking. I loved this woman. For nearly a decade. Through layoffs, deaths in the family, my father's heart attack and her miscarriage. I was there, present, loyal. And now I realized that love had been a one-way street for years. My phone buzzed. Claire, I let it ring, then again. Another text popped up. Can we talk, please? I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. I heard you, Claire. A pause. What do you mean? I texted back, simple and direct. I heard everything. The phone fell silent. The next few hours felt like falling into a black hole. There was no up, no down, just the heavy weight of disbelief pulling me further into a quiet, suffocating numbness. I didn't drive far that night, maybe 20 miles out of town to a quiet overlook near Lake Merrin. It was a place we had gone once on a weekend drive. Claire had called it peaceful, her head resting on my shoulder as the sun dipped below the waterline. Now it was just cold wind and silence. I parked, turned off the engine, and just sat there with the duffel bag still on the passenger seat. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't look at it. The glow of the screen made my chest tighten. Claire had been part of every routine in my life. Her toothbrush next to mine, Her mug always on the left side of the cabinet. The way she hummed when she watered the plants. Our lives were woven together in ways I hadn't realized until I saw the threads unraveling. I thought about going to a hotel, but I knew I wouldn't sleep, and I couldn't afford to lie in a strange bed with the ghosts of her words haunting me. So I reclined the seat and let the cold air slip through the cracked window. It didn't matter. I was already frozen from the inside out. I drifted into an uncomfortable half-sleep and woke up with the sunrise glaring through the windshield. I felt stiff, disoriented, and older somehow, as if the night had aged me a decade. My phone had 7 missed calls. Claire, 1 voicemail. I listened. Eli, I don't know where you are and I'm scared. I didn't mean for you to hear what I said. I just needed to talk to someone. Please come home so we can talk. Please. She sounded like someone who regretted getting caught, not someone who regretted what she had said. I deleted the message. I got coffee at a gas station. The attendant didn't even look at me. I guess heartbreak doesn't leave a visible mark. I stared at myself in the mirror above the sink in the men's room. Red eyes, hollow stare. I looked like a man who'd been mugged by his own life. Later that morning, I called in sick to the school. Said I needed a mental health day. Maybe 2. Principal Vargas didn't ask questions. Maybe she heard the edge in my voice, or maybe she knew what it felt like to be blindsided by someone you loved. I drove for hours. No destination, just the road. Music low on the radio. Every love song felt like a cruel joke. Every stretch of familiar highway reminded me of a road trip, a shared memory, a time when Claire used to lean over and kiss my hand for no reason at all. By early afternoon, I found myself in a small town called Windley, one of those places that has a diner, a drugstore, and a main street that hasn't changed since the 70s. I parked and walked into the diner, needing something, coffee, distraction, maybe a sign from the universe. The waitress was in her 60s, with kind eyes and no patience for small talk. "Rough morning, sweetheart?" she asked, pouring coffee without waiting for my answer. "More like a rough decade," I said. She snorted. "Ain't that the truth? Pancakes or eggs?" "Pancakes." "Good choice. No one ever cries over pancakes." I almost smiled. While I waited, I stared out the window at nothing. An old couple walked past the diner, holding hands. I wondered if they ever had a moment like mine, if they had ever sat in silence, pretending things were fine when they were already broken. The pancakes came. I didn't taste them. I ate mechanically just to keep my hands busy. And then my phone vibrated again. A text from Claire. "I'm sorry, I really am. I miss you. Can we talk tonight?" I stared at it. My thumb hovered over the reply button. My stomach twisted. I could go back. I could listen to her excuses. I could convince myself that what we had was salvageable. But the truth was, I didn't believe it anymore. Not after hearing how she really felt. I didn't respond. I powered off my phone, paid the check, and walked out into the daylight, still not sure where I was going next. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't going back. The diner was behind me now, along with the last conversation I'd probably ever have with Heather. The sunlight cast long shadows across the parking lot, but I didn't feel the warmth. Not yet. I was still numb, like the pieces of my life had been broken off and scattered, and I hadn't figured out how to pick them up again. I drove aimlessly, letting the road choose my path. That's how I ended up in the small coastal town of Delmont, a quiet speck on the map that hadn't changed in decades, the kind of place where time moved slower and people still waved at strangers. I didn't know what I was looking for. Peace, perhaps, or just distance. I checked into a modest inn run by an elderly couple who didn't ask questions. They handed me the key with kind smiles, as if they understood what kind of man I was. Lost. That night I couldn't sleep. The bed was too quiet. My head too loud. I kept hearing Heather's voice on loop. Not the voice she used when we laughed on the porch or whispered dreams before bed. No, this voice was sharper, cold, resentful. The voice of someone who had already said goodbye in her heart long before I walked out the door. I wondered how long she had been living in that secret silence. How many dinners had we shared, where she smiled while secretly mourning a marriage that had died for her years ago. The pain didn't come in one sweeping wave. It dripped like water torture. Every little memory, every gesture now felt weaponized. The way she used to hold my hand at dinner. The way she'd kiss my forehead when I stayed up too late. Were those moments real, or just habit, or worse, pity? I was trying not to hate her. I knew it would be easier if I did. But the truth was I had loved Heather with every part of me. Not perfectly, not without flaws, but genuinely. And now I was a man without a center. The next morning I sat on the rocky shoreline just after sunrise. The ocean roared in front of me like it had something to say. Behind me, the town was just starting to wake up. But out here, I was alone with the waves and the ache in my chest. I needed a plan. I couldn't just keep running. So I did what I hadn't done in years. I opened a notebook and started writing. It started with small things. What do I want? Where do I go from here? Am I angry or just heartbroken? The truth poured out in uneven lines. I wrote about the moment I realized Heather no longer loved me. I wrote about how I had overlooked myself, how I had become the background character in my own life. Then, almost involuntarily, I wrote something that stopped me cold. Maybe this is what starting over really looks like. Not fire and fury, but silence and soil. Something has to die before something new can grow. I stared at that sentence for a long time, and for the first time since I'd walked out, I felt the tiniest flicker of something, hope, maybe, or purpose. I didn't want to go back, but I also didn't want to be just a man who left. I wanted to become the man who built something new. That day I signed up for a month-long stay in Delmont. I needed time, and this town gave me just enough anonymity to breathe. I started helping the innkeepers with small repairs, tightening door handles, repainting porch rails. It was menial, grounding. It reminded me that my hands still worked, that I could still create, even in the wreckage. Each morning I returned to the shoreline, notebook in hand. I began writing letters to myself, future entries in a life I hadn't yet lived. I wrote the kind of man I wanted to be, strong, honest, respected, and more than anything, whole. Heather never called again. After her last message, "I hope you're safe. Please take care of yourself." There was only silence. It was the silence I needed, and in that silence, I was learning to hear myself again. It had been a week since I walked out of the house I once called home, a week since I left Emily behind with nothing but a duffel bag and 1,000 shattered memories. I hadn't spoken to her since that night. Her texts came like waves, short, frantic, then long and remorseful. I didn't respond to a single one. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew if I opened that door again, I might never be able to close it. I found temporary refuge in a friend's lake house about 2 hours outside of Charlotte. Remote, quiet. The kind of place where even the birds respected the silence. I spent my mornings staring at the water, afternoons reading old paperbacks I'd once claimed I never had time for, and evenings trying not to think about how my life had unraveled like a bad sweater. Then came Saturday, the day Emily drove all the way out to find me. I had left no address, no obvious trail. But I should have known better. She had ways, she always did. I was standing on the wooden deck, a mug of black coffee in my hand, when I saw the dusty blue SUV pull into the gravel driveway. My breath caught. I didn't move. I just watched as she stepped out, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail, her face bare of makeup, like she knew coming here meant she couldn't wear a mask. She stood by the car for a few moments, probably deciding whether to walk up or turn around. Then, with visible hesitation, she walked up the porch steps. "Hi," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't know if you'd be here." I stared at her, not responding right away. Then I gave a short nod. "I'm here." She looked around, taking in the place. "It's peaceful." It was. Her lips pressed into a thin line at that. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. "Suit yourself." She entered like a ghost, like someone walking through the ruins of a house that once held joy. I could feel the tension in her every step, as if each board creaked beneath the weight of everything unsaid. We sat at opposite ends of the old wooden table in the kitchen, a half-empty coffee pot between us. She didn't reach for it, neither did I. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. "Then don't say anything," I replied, staring at the steam rising from my mug. "Unless it's the truth." Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I was scared." "Of what?" "Of telling you how I really felt," she said. "I didn't want to hurt you." I let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't want to hurt me, so you lied to me for years." Her eyes watered, but she blinked rapidly. It wasn't always a lie. I did love you. That's the thing, Emily. I believed that. I really did. But it turns out I was the only one still trying. She looked down. I know. A long silence followed, the kind of silence that hums like a power line above a lonely road. Finally, she looked up, eyes rimmed red. I thought maybe if I just waited, things would change, that I'd fall in love with you again. And if I hadn't overheard you, I asked, would you have told me? Or would you have let me waste another 10 years? She opened her mouth but said nothing. That was my answer. I stood, the chair scraping against the wood. I came out here to breathe, Emily, not to relive the suffocation. She stood too, a flicker of panic on her face. Please, Tyler, I didn't come to fight. I wanted to see you. I needed to. Why? Because I miss you, she said. I miss us. There is no us, I said. There's a past. There's a memory. But whatever us was, it died the moment I realized I was just background noise in your life. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, but I felt nothing. Not hate, not anger, just absence. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. I'll leave, she said, but please don't shut the door completely, not yet. I didn't answer. She left anyway, and the silence that returned after the door shut felt like the first real peace I'd had in months. After Emily left the lake house, the silence she left behind lingered longer than I expected. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel closure. What I felt was strange, like I had walked out of a fog, only to realize I was now standing in a desert, disoriented and bone dry. I didn't cry, I didn't break down, but I also didn't move for what felt like hours. Just me, the coffee gone cold in my hands, and the ghost of a marriage I had buried with no funeral. On the second morning after her visit, I packed up and left the lake house. No goodbyes, no messages. I didn't want to sit in stillness anymore. I needed life around me, not to distract me, but to remind me I was still part of the living. I drove back into the city, not Charlotte, not anywhere with memories of her, but toward Asheville, a few hours west. The mountains stood like old guardians, unbothered by human pain. Something about that felt safe. I checked into a quiet little hotel on the edge of downtown. No one knew me. No one asked questions. I liked it that way. The first night I wandered into a nearby diner, not because I was hungry, but because I couldn't sit alone in that hotel room any longer. It was small, old, but clean, exactly the kind of place you expect to find 100 stories hiding behind the eyes of strangers. I slid into a booth at the back, ordered a black coffee and something I didn't care to eat, and then, while mindlessly stirring sugar into the cup, I noticed her. She was seated at table 7, alone. Young, but not too young, maybe early 30s. Auburn hair pulled into a lazy bun, dark sweater hanging loose around her shoulders. She had a paperback open in front of her, but she wasn't reading. Just staring out the window, cup of tea cradled between her palms like it was the only warmth in the world. She didn't notice me watching. Or if she did, she didn't care. The waitress brought my order and smiled. You should talk to her, she said, nodding toward table 7. I raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? The waitress grinned. Samantha. She comes in every Thursday, same table, same tea, same stare. I don't think she's here for the food. I shook my head. I'm not exactly in the mood to meet anyone. That's the best time, she said, refilling my cup, when neither of you are pretending to be fine. She walked off before I could answer. I should have ignored the suggestion, but something about the way Samantha sat there, so still, so sad, felt painfully familiar, like watching a mirror of my own heartache. So after 20 minutes of internal debate, I did something I never do. I stood up, walked over to table 7 and asked, "Is this seat taken?" Samantha looked up. Her eyes were hazel, tired but sharp. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn me away either. "No," she said, "but I'm not great company." "Perfect," I replied. "Neither am I." I sat down. And just like that, two strangers shared a silence that was louder than any conversation. We didn't ask about exes. We didn't talk about pain. We just existed, parallel lines, running next to each other for the briefest of moments. After a while, she closed her book, looked at me and said, "You lost someone too?" I nodded. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. And in that diner, under flickering fluorescent lights and the low hum of an old jukebox, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Seen. Not fixed, not healed, but seen. Samantha didn't smile often, but when she did, it was a quiet kind of beauty, the kind that doesn't demand attention but earns it anyway. Over the next few days, we kept ending up at that same diner, not by arrangement, not by coincidence, just rhythm. I'd arrive in the evening, slide into my booth. She'd already be at table 7, a cup of chamomile steaming in front of her. Sometimes we spoke, sometimes we didn't. But the silence between us was no longer unfamiliar. It had turned into something soft, like the hush of snow at midnight. I never asked her what brought her there. Not directly. But people leak when they're around someone who doesn't ask questions. Pain has a way of slipping through the cracks when it's finally safe. One night, Samantha looked up from her tea and asked, "Have you ever built your whole life around someone and then realized they never even asked for it?" Her voice didn't tremble, but it was close. I didn't answer right away. Eventually, I nodded. Yeah. She stared at her tea for a long time. I married a man who looked perfect on paper. MBA, tall, charming, all the right words, but none of them were true. He wanted a trophy. I wanted a partner. He got bored with me the minute I stopped playing house. She didn't say more, and I didn't press. Instead, I shared something I hadn't said out loud yet. My wife, well, ex-wife now, had told someone on the phone that she hadn't loved me in years. I overheard it. Samantha winced, eyes softening. That's cruel. It was honest, I said, more to myself than her. Brutally honest. I wasn't sure why I told her that. Maybe because she wouldn't try to fix it. She wouldn't say, "You'll be okay," or "You'll find someone better." Samantha didn't deal in comfort cliches. She just listened. And somehow, that was enough. Later that week, she didn't show up. I kept glancing at table 7, but it stayed empty. Something in my chest twisted. I didn't know what that meant. I shouldn't have cared. But I did. The next night, same result. Table 7 remained untouched. My coffee tasted bitter. On the third day, I asked the waitress, trying to sound casual, "Has Samantha been around?" She glanced at the empty table, then back at me. "Didn't show yesterday either. Sometimes she disappears for a while. She's got stuff, complicated stuff." "Okay," I said, though my stomach was turning knots. Back in the hotel, the loneliness returned. Not the kind I could shake off with noise or distraction. The kind that seeps into your bones when someone you didn't expect to matter suddenly does. The next morning, I found myself wandering the streets of Asheville aimlessly. I had nowhere to be, no reason to be anywhere. I ended up at a bookstore tucked between a record shop and a bakery, the kind of place that smelled like dust, paper, and forgotten dreams. And there she was, Samantha. In the poetry aisle, fingers tracing the spine of a Sylvia Plath collection. She didn't notice me at first, or maybe she did and pretended not to. I walked over. "You ghosting me?" She turned slowly, caught between a smirk and an apology. "I needed a few days. You okay?" She nodded, but her eyes betrayed her. "I'm fine." "You're not." She sighed. "You ever feel like you're finally moving on, and then your past shows up with a baseball bat?" "Yeah," I said. "That's exactly how it feels." She closed the book and tucked it back on the shelf. My ex-husband came into town, unexpectedly, brought flowers like we were still married. I didn't tell him where I was. Somehow, he still found me. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. She looked at me and smiled, tired but real. "It's okay. I just needed a couple days to remember that his presence doesn't undo the work I've done." Then, almost shyly, she added, "It helped knowing someone was still sitting at table 7. I smiled. That night, we didn't go to the diner. We went for a walk instead. The kind of walk that didn't require a destination, just two people finding their pace in a world they thought had left them behind. The bell above the door chimed again. I barely looked up from my coffee until I heard a familiar voice slice through the soft murmur of the diner. "Tobias." I didn't need to look to know who it was. Meredith. Her voice had always been soft, almost apologetically so, but today it carried a sharpness I hadn't heard before. I turned slowly, coffee in hand, and met her gaze. She stood near the entrance, her arms crossed, a jacket thrown carelessly over her wrinkled blouse. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, her mascara slightly smudged. She hadn't slept. "You disappeared," she said, almost accusatory. "No," I replied evenly. I walked away. She blinked, her confidence faltering. "Can we talk?" I gestured to the booth across from mine. "You came all this way. Sit." She slid into the seat across from me, folding her hands neatly on the table like a student about to explain a failed test. The waitress dropped off more coffee, giving Meredith a glance but not saying a word. "Tobias, I didn't mean for you to hear that," she started. "But I did," I said, my tone flat. "You said you couldn't stand me, that you hadn't loved me in years." Her eyes dropped to her lap. "It wasn't fair, I was venting." "Don't do that, don't pretend it was just frustration. That wasn't some careless outburst, that was truth, Meredith." She flinched. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you. But you did. Every day you stayed and pretended. That hurt more than honesty ever could." She looked like she might cry, and for a moment I almost felt sorry. Almost, but the numbness returned like a wave, dulling the empathy I used to live in. "I felt stuck," she whispered. "So you let me believe we were fine." She nodded slowly. "Why now? Why are you here?" Her eyes searched mine, filled with a desperation she didn't know how to express. "Because when you left, it felt final, and I realized I don't want that." "You don't want to lose your safety net," I replied. "You don't want discomfort." She reached across the table, fingers grazing mine. "I'm sorry. I know I hurt you. But can we try again? Please." I stared at her hand, the same hand I used to hold in church pews, at family dinners, in hospital waiting rooms. "I don't think you're sorry for what you did," I said. "You're sorry you got caught." She pulled her hand back like she'd been burned. The days after the confrontation in the cafe felt strangely hollow. Tobias found himself waking up early in Lucas's guest room, a light breeze whispering through the old blinds, dust motes dancing in the morning sun. Each morning was quiet, peaceful, but it was the kind of peace that arrived after a storm had destroyed everything you once knew. Lucas gave him space. They didn't talk much about Meredith. Instead, they spoke about childhood memories, baseball games, the stubborn dog they'd grown up with, and occasionally about nothing at all. It was exactly what Tobias needed. The laughter was slow to return, but when it did, it felt real. But Meredith's silence loomed. No more texts, no more calls, nothing. At first, Tobias welcomed it, but eventually the quiet started to echo. Not because he missed her, but because it made him realize just how long he'd gone unheard, even while they still shared a roof. Her absence confirmed a painful truth. She had never planned to fight for him. There was no plea, no apology, no real grief. Just nothing. One evening, Lucas found Tobias on the back porch, nursing a bottle of beer, lost in thought. "She still hasn't said anything?" Lucas asked. Tobias shook his head. "Radio silence. It's like I walked out of a room and she just shut the door." Lucas leaned on the railing beside him. "You know, sometimes silence isn't peace, it's cowardice." Tobias nodded slowly. "That's what hurts the most. Not that she stopped loving me, but that when I walked away, she didn't even try." Lucas was quiet for a while before speaking again. "What are you going to do now?" Tobias exhaled. "I've been asking myself that. I could go back to Boston, try to rebuild something, maybe get my old job back. Or maybe I just start completely over." The next morning, Tobias made a decision. He packed his duffel bag again, not with the panic of before, but with intention. He was heading out west, Denver, a city he'd never lived in but always been curious about. Mountains, clean air, a place where no one knew his name. It wasn't running anymore, it was rediscovery. Lucas helped him load the car. "You know you've got a place here if you ever need it." "I know," Tobias said, gripping his brother's shoulder. "Thank you. For everything." Before he left, Tobias drove past the home he had shared with Meredith one last time. The house looked the same, but the lawn was overgrown. Her car was parked out front. A delivery box sat untouched on the porch. He didn't stop. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. There was nothing left inside for him. As he merged onto the interstate, the miles rolled by like chapters closing. With every passing hour, he felt lighter, like he was shedding a version of himself that had grown too small. Somewhere between Ohio and Colorado, Tobias started journaling. At first, it was just scattered thoughts, fragments, memories. But then the words started to flow, stories, reflections, truths he'd buried for years. It became more than therapy. It became purpose. He set up in a small Airbnb in Denver near a park. Days passed quietly, but this time the silence was full of possibility. He explored the city, hiked trails, tried new foods, and wrote. One night he hit publish on a blog he had named The Disappearance Diaries. He didn't expect much, but within days, readers flooded in, comments, emails, strangers saying, "You're telling my story." And then came the email from a publisher. They wanted to talk. For the first time in a long time, Tobias smiled, not the forced, polite kind, but something full and bright. His heartbreak had been real, but so was his rebirth. He looked out at the Denver skyline and whispered to himself, maybe disappearing was the best thing I ever did. For days after his last conversation with Meredith, Jacob remained at his brother's cabin, surrounded by trees, silence, and the rhythmic hum of crickets and cicadas that sang their nighttime lullabies. The quiet helped. Or at least, that's what he told himself. But healing wasn't quiet. Healing screamed. It screamed in the middle of the night, when Jacob woke up gasping, dreaming of the moment he heard Meredith's voice say she hadn't loved him in years. It screamed in the way his heart twisted every time he checked his phone and saw no new messages, half dreading, half hoping. It screamed in the smell of coffee every morning when he poured 2 mugs without thinking, then had to dump one out. Lucas had been patient. He never asked how Jacob was doing, never tried to offer useless advice. Instead, he made space, literal and emotional, for Jacob to sort through the tangled mess of his past 10 years. One evening, after helping Lucas fix a fence around the property, Jacob sat on the porch, staring at the distant sunset. Lucas handed him a beer and sank into the chair beside him. "You ever think maybe this was supposed to happen?" Lucas asked. Jacob gave a bitter chuckle. "You mean my wife falling out of love with me and lying about it for years?" "No," Lucas said calmly. "I mean you finally hearing it, finally waking up." Jacob didn't respond right away. He let the words simmer. Was it a wake-up call? Or had it been a slow death finally pronounced? 2 days later, Jacob packed his things, not out of anger, not out of sadness, but out of clarity. He had unfinished business, one more page to turn before he could start a new chapter. He texted Meredith first. "Can we meet? One last time, just to close the door properly." She replied almost instantly. "Yes, whenever you're ready." They met at a park halfway between their old house and Lucas's cabin, a neutral place. Meredith showed up in a simple navy dress, no makeup, hair tied back. For once, she didn't seem polished or perfect. She just seemed tired. Jacob noticed it immediately, the way her shoulders slouched, the shadows beneath her eyes. Grief lived in her body now, too. They walked slowly down a trail, neither knowing where to start. Finally, Jacob broke the silence. "I didn't ask you here to yell or blame you. I just need to understand." Meredith nodded. "I know, and I want you to." She talked first, about how the love had faded without her even noticing, about how the life they built began to feel like a performance, about how she didn't hate him, but hated the version of herself that never spoke up. Jacob listened, really listened, and when she was done, he took a deep breath. "I think part of me always knew," he said softly. "But I loved the idea of us too much to face the truth." She looked down. "I'm sorry for how I handled it." "I know you are, but that doesn't change what happened." There was a long pause. "So what now?" Meredith finally asked. Jacob smiled sadly. "Now? I start over. You do too. We let go of the guilt, the shame. The weight of 10 years. And us? We were something real once, Jacob said, and that deserves to be respected. But it's over. Tears welled in her eyes. Will I see you again? Maybe one day. When it doesn't hurt anymore. She nodded. They hugged, not like lovers, but like two people who had lived through a war together. There was sorrow in that embrace, but also peace. Jacob turned and walked away, the sun behind him, stretching his shadow forward. He didn't cry. He didn't check his phone. He didn't look back. He was done, and finally, he was free.